Okay, well, thank you very much. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for the invitation to present here. Maybe like the previous speaker, I'll just start out with a bit of background about myself. I'm not used to being in a setting which discusses disinformation. Myself, I had an organization called European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights, and as the name suggests, I work in the area of sexual reproductive health and rights. That means the right to abortion, access to family planning, cervical cancer prevention, maternal health, etc. And I've had the pleasure to interact with some of the previous speakers. Dealing with disinformation is a bit of a new and uncharted area for us. The reason that brought us here today is because, as you may know, abortion specifically and some other areas of sexual reproductive health and rights, they have traditionally been rather contested areas of human rights. So whenever abortion was liberalized in many countries, there soon appeared to be an anti-abortion movement, often linked to the church. We know that in some countries it's a very controversial issue within the European Union, but also with our friends over in the United States. And so we've been familiar with that. And what brought us here today was because we started seeing about 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, that there was an increased level of contestation of what had previously been rather pacified areas, so that even though abortion was controversial, it had not been a main issue in many countries. But about 10, 12 years ago, we started seeing it appearing in many different places. And so our members at national level would contact us and they'd say, Neil, we have this anti-abortion demonstration or an initiative against comprehensive sexuality education in this country or that country. And we started seeing that there were the same names of organizations and individuals appearing all over Europe, from Portugal to Latvia to Norway to Strasbourg in the parliament. And that's when we started realizing that there was something new taking place. Okay. Myself, having been raised in the United States, I was rather familiar with anti-abortion activism, but my European side thought, well, in Europe, we're much more advanced than that. We've settled these issues back in the 70s, and we started seeing, well, it's not quite like that. And so with this increased activism, we started studying it, and then starting in 2018, we produced what has now become 3 reports. The first one, Restoring the Natural Order, the second, Modern Day Crusaders, and the third is Tip of the Iceberg. And I'd like to share with you some of the main takeaways of these 3 reports, and how, in my opinion, the contestation, if not the outright war on gender equality and reproductive rights, is really a new way of undermining liberal democracy here in Europe, but also in many parts of the world. So I've structured my talk into 5 points, and then I'll end with a synthesis and a conclusion. So the first point is that we're not dealing with the same religious debates of the 1970s as we are now. So what we see is that the contestation about abortion, sexual reproductive rights, including contraception, LGBT rights, etc., it's not so much about religion or social conservatism or wanting to protect faith or certain traditional values. That's the fig leaf that's being put on it. What we see is that, in fact, this is a very modern political power project, and it uses religion to shield its actual intents. And we can see this by analyzing who is doing this and what they're saying. So first of all, we see that there's a whole new category of organizations which have emerged. So it's no longer the pro-life organizations that existed in many countries. We now see a whole new range of think tanks, NGOs, and even political parties who know how to access power. A second point is that they have become extremely sophisticated, so that far from organizing protests in front of abortion clinics or handing out leaflets, etc., They now know how to write a draft piece of law and have the allies inside parliament to introduce it at the right moments. This is what happened in Poland in 2016, in Spain in 2013 and 14, and we see this happening in a number of other countries. It's happening right now also in Italy, not even 1 week with the new government of Giorgia Meloni. We also see that another aspect of their professionalization is that of being able to engage in litigation. So that we see that one of the tactics that they use is a very strategic, targeted harassment of those who stand up for women's rights and LGBT rights. And myself, I was chatting with Marta Lempart. She's the head of the Polish women's strike, the lady who organized those massive demonstrations that I'm sure most of you, all of you, must have seen at least on CNN and your national news. When I saw her last in June of this year, she mentioned to me that she had just reached her 101st law case against her. I heard most recently that there were now about 130 law cases against her by the government and different ultra-conservative NGOs. So when you see this happening like this, you can say it's not an accident, it's part of a strategy. We also see that these actors, they're not the nice, cuddly little Christians or parents groups that they claim to be operating at local, national level. In fact, they are very, very well connected transnationally. They organize meetings just like we all do, just like this. And in these meetings, they do what we do. They exchange, they brainstorm, they strategize, etc. And which explains how it is that we see similar initiatives appearing in different geographies more or less at the same time. So if you project yourselves back almost a decade ago, why did traditional marriage referenda happen almost simultaneously or more within a few years apart in Croatia, in Slovakia, in Poland, in Romania? That's because these actors came up with an idea, felt that the time was right to run with it in their countries, and then ran with this, and in some cases they were successful. Another point, so it's not the same debate as it was in the 1970s. A second point that's important to keep in mind is that it is not a popular or grassroots movement either. It is, in fact, a very strategic form of astroturfing. However, this astroturfing has the specificity of having religious people as the primary target. So you have a certain type of elite there targeting religious people, hoping to leverage religious communities onto their agenda. And that's what we see, happening. And these people are using gender in a way to sanitize what are essentially anti-human rights positions. And as I said, they're very well organized. They meet in a certain number of different settings. One of them that we revealed in 2018 is a brainstorming networking session that was very important to them. It was also a secretive meeting. They would specifically say no journalists allowed, Chatham House rules apply, etc. It was a meeting called Agenda Europe. When we outed them, shortly after then, it became costly for those organizations and individuals involved in that, and they soon disbanded. But they also have other more open settings, such as the World Congress of Families that met in Italy in 2019. And also hearing some of the speakers earlier today, it made me think that I should mention one other setting that's often used in order to socialize especially political elites, is that of national prayer breakfasts. So we have the National Prayer Breakfast, which started out in the United States, which brings together Christians of all denominations, and this practice has then been spread across different countries, mainly in Europe now. And what we see by taking a look at who is a speaker at the National Prayer Breakfast, for example, there's one that took place in the European Parliament a couple of years ago. The main speaker was Brigitte Bardot, one of the main spokespersons and organizers of La Manif pour tous, the homophobic marches of France. So when you can see that what is meant to be an ecumenical Christian type of thing where all Christian politicians get together and share their faith, but your main speaker is heading a homophobic campaign, you can see how this is meant to socialize the political elite in a certain place onto certain things. We also see that they have created their own entire, what I would call a disinformation universe. We see that these organizations have created a whole category of pseudoscience and pseudo-academia, so that some of them have established universities. There's one in Poland called Collegium Intermarium, with fake professors offering fake degrees. We also see that they've created their own media. And what's interesting with this media is that you have an ultra-conservative, anti-abortion, anti-gender organization. Then there's one branch that's a spin-off and creates a specific media outlet. That media outlet then feeds into the more conservative right-wing media, and then it filters into the mainstream media. And we see this happening in a number of different countries around Europe, among them Spain, Poland, elsewhere. And perhaps the most sophisticated that we found is fake fact-checking initiatives. So imagine you have a fake EU Disinfo Lab that would take all this work that the EU Disinfo Lab does and then fact-check it against the pseudoscience that they're doing. And in a way, they're creating a hall of mirrors so that you don't, if you don't know what's happening, you really have no way of getting to the truth of what things are. A third point is that this is much bigger than what people think. Okay, we released a study last year entitled Tip of the Iceberg, where after what we had shown about this anti-gender, anti-abortion movement and how it's infiltrating politics, how much funding was behind this, because they were saying, Neil, this is very nice, we understand this and the strategies, but what's the money behind this? So what we did is we identified a sample of over 120 of these organizations only in Europe, active all over Europe, and we tracked down their financials. We found that for 54 of these organizations, so less than half of our ideal sample size. And what we're able to find is that for these 54 organizations, anti-gender, anti-human rights activism, they had been able to generate over $700 million over a decade spanning from 2009 to 2018. So $700 million, that's quite important. If we look further into that $700 million, what we can find is that, one, it quadrupled over the space of that decade, so that in 2009, they were able to generate and spend just under $20 million a year. By the end of that decade, it had reached almost 80 million. So if many of us are familiar with budgets, if your budget increases by a factor of 4 over a 10-year period, you can do a lot more, and this is what we see. When we dig down further and we take a look at where does the money come from, we can find 3 geographic sources. One of them is the United States, which is not a big surprise. When it comes to anti-abortion activism, we always know that there's an American connection in there, and there was. But the Americans account for only 80-some million dollars of the 700 million, which is significant, but it's not the lion's share. What's interesting with the American money is that it is specifically, strategically targeted towards litigation. So it's American organizations linked with the Christian right in the US who set up offices in Europe who specialize in taking cases through the national and European courts. And they already have a few cases pending before the European Court of Human Rights, usually with the perspective of establishing that religious freedom is some sort of a higher order of human right than other human rights in terms of women's health, non-discrimination, or equality. So that my right as a Christian is more important than your right as a woman to access certain health or non-discrimination pieces of legislation. So that's the scale of what we're dealing with now in terms of the US. The other 2 sources were Russian Federation, which is much bigger than even the US in terms of funding, accounting for $188 million over this 10-year period, coming mainly from 2 Russian oligarchs, Vladimir Yakunin and Konstantin Malafeyev. Both of them linked to the very far right, and even within Russia. So it's not just the far right; it's the Russian far right. And they've been. And at one point, they were close to the Kremlin. This is a very this changes quite a bit. So you can never say that they are close. They have been close at some point. And what they did was to create a whole series of different entities, think tanks, media outlets, endowment funds, foundations, etc., where the objective of them, and it's what we heard a little bit from some of the previous speakers, was essentially to socialize Western elites onto a pro-Russian agenda. And now this pro-Russian agenda posits that Russia is an authentic, traditional Christian country, in contrast to the EU, which has degenerated and has become decadent and has lost its true sense of purpose. And so this is what what the Russian money is for. However, the biggest source of funding, 437 million out of the 700 million, came from Europe itself. And from Europe itself, we have our own economic and social elites, so rich people all over the world, all over Europe, etc. Also, state funding accounted for a significant part of this, different astroturfing enterprises. What's interesting with the European money is that a lot of it came from well-known brands or well-known wealthy people, high net worth individuals. The challenge we face in Europe is that is that of linguistic and national silos, so that the French people know the conservative French people funding the homophobic marches and the Christian and Catholic campaigning. The Germans know this for Germany, but we don't have ways of comparing this across different countries, whereas this movement, as I've said before, has become transnational as much as we all are, and so the funding then goes from one national country into different European initiatives. A fourth point here I want to emphasize is that we have a new set of actors. So I've said there's a whole new set of new organizations that have emerged. What I think is important to point out is that a number of these different, especially at the civil society level, these would be organizations that academics have qualified as uncivil society. They don't necessarily share the same groundings in liberal democracy and rule of law as many of us would. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, so that it's not simply a question that I'm in favor of the right to abortion, someone else is not. But there's a difference in terms of the respect for the courts, the respect for parliament, and also how it is that we engage with public institutions. Just as a small example of this, the recent court case, the recent overturning of abortion rights in the United States, bears some striking parallel with what happened in Poland in 2020, which was done in both cases through acts of the court, not through parliament or anything like this. And in both cases, the courts had been in some way compromised. In Poland, the Constitutional Tribunal was kicked out. A new one was put in place by the new government. And in the United States, it was stacked by the Republican Party. Let's see. I'm being told I have limited time, so I'll wrap up rather quickly. A fifth point I want to point out is that the reasons for social conservatism now have mutated over what they used to be. So that on the one hand, there is the religious normative aspirations. People do want to have a set of laws that reflect their religious values. But what we see here is that those religious values are those that have been interpreted by a very minority, most extremist and vocal current within that faith community. But they've been joined by other communities as well. And so that we see now two additional groups having joined in this in contesting these types of human rights. One are the ultranationalists that we see in some parts of Eastern Europe, and for them, gender-related issues is part of a new reinvented national narrative, so that in order to be a proper Hungarian, you have to be a real man, and women, they know their place and make plenty of babies. That's a part of the new national narrative. Interestingly, the new national narrative specific to each country is remarkably alike, depending, regardless of which country you go to. A third category here, and one which we seldom, we often overlook, is that of what I would call hyper-capitalists, or what in the UK most recently have been called the libertarians. And this, we can see that they've joined in going against human rights and sexuality and reproduction, mainly from their perspective of wanting a very small state. If you want to have human rights in a certain area, you need a state to protect those rights. But this is anathema to this libertarian hyper-capitalist thinking, and so we see strange alliances of very, very right-wing capitalist libertarian think tanks producing ideas and arguments which go against abortion or women's rights, etc. And so we see this taking place as well. So maybe I'll end here with just a few points. That what we see is that this is having an impact on many people around Europe. The actual human rights of Europeans now is being undermined by this renewed activism against gender equality and sexual and reproductive health and rights. I was in Poland just this weekend. Earlier in the week, there was a trial of a young woman called Justina, who is facing an actual trial because she helped someone else procure an abortion pill. Okay, so this is the level we're dealing with now. And also, just in Italy, Meloni has, barely in government now, there is already a draft law standing on the Senate floor in order to give the fetus a certain status within the Italian civil code. The second point, we need to recognize that gender and sexual and reproductive health and rights are right now a current priority area of attack and contestation for the up-and-coming authoritarian political actors. And in fact, it is contesting these issues which has become part of the toolkit of the authoritarian political actors that we see in Europe. And the reasons for this are logical, not logical. On the one hand, they get to by attacking these issues, they attack the progressives, the left, and all the international institutions. But more importantly, they establish a precedent that human rights don't need to apply to certain categories of people or could be curtailed for certain reasons. And then finally, I would say that we've known that this has been happening now for the better part of 10 years, but we've not been very good at dealing with this. On the one hand, it's partly because the information is spread across different national countries and different languages. So we need to devise mechanisms in order to overcome that. Separately, our institutions, and I think this was remarked by some of the earlier panels, are very unprepared for how to deal with what can be called uncivil society. There's really no mechanism for the parliament, for the courts, or anything like this to deal with this, and so they're left like this, really quite helpless. And I would say that with this, we need to take this into account because right now we're in 2022. 2023, by this time next year, we will all be talking about the European elections for 2024. And we can be certain that they will be gearing up, these movements, the authoritarian far right, along with an anti-gender equality, anti-human rights agenda, will be preparing for the elections in 2024. And I think that's what we need to prepare for. So thank you very much.
Many of us during the last years have felt that something was going on, but it was good to have these various movements explained and put into context. I certainly know, as a woman, I somehow feel more under threat now than I did back in my youth. I'm not going to say when, but things seem to have got worse or show signs of getting worse after many years of equality improving. So fascinating, thank you so much. But question, Julie, I'm sure, yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah? Thank you very much, Neil. We worked together when I was in the European Parliament, and I was very shocked when I was first working on policy and different resolutions and things that in my political group, we had to always delete the word family. And I just wondered, because we knew what family meant to the right-wing people who were putting it into the texts, and it made me very sad in a way that we had to disown that word. We had to always delete it, and I wondered how toxic that actual word is, family.
I think that's a very good point, and the question you raise is an ongoing discussion among those who want to advance human rights in sexuality and reproduction, whether we should try to avoid the vocabulary that the opponents have tried to claim for themselves. There's the word family. Another word that they like to use is dignity as well. So should we be avoiding those words, or should we be trying to recapture them in some way? Well, specifically the issue of family, I think there's the way that the word can be used. Does one use family, or does one use the plural of the word families? And I think then we can have, we may be able to find some areas where we can use the word.
Thank you so much. One more question. Lady, please.
You mentioned that some of those groups did astroturfing to kind of advance their cause, and I was wondering what platforms you saw it on and what form it took.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question that I'd like to answer. Yeah, so in terms of astroturfing, one of the best platforms for this is Citizen Go. Okay, which claims to be a community of like-minded people that wants to make citizens very active. What they and so they have right now, I think they have a community, I think, of about 17 million people around the world. Last I checked, they operate in about 11 languages. And what's interesting is that it's a very socially conservative, ultra-conservative platform. And they work on a range of different issues. So if you're upset that Netflix, all their programming is too much LGBT, then go on to Citizen Go and you'll have many, many different petitions that you can sign there. What makes that, and when you sign the petition, then you become part of this community of 17 million people around the world, and they'll speak to you in your own language, and then they'll hit you up for like small contributions, 5 euros, 10 euros, etc. Okay, that's not bad. I mean, the progressives, Avaz, Move On, they do the same thing. Okay. What's interesting with Citizen Go is that we were able to find out how it is that they were set up in 2013. And so far from being funded purely by individual donations, we see who it is that funded them originally. We were able to find their project proposal and then cover letters to potential donors. And so these potential donors included, no surprise, different high-ranking people within the US Christian right, so that we know that US money came into this from organizations very close to the Republican Party and the big US billionaires there. Separately, there's money that came in from Spanish billionaires. Those Spanish billionaires specifically all have family links that go back to the Franco era in Spain. So it comes from specific circles within Spanish society. But also, interestingly, two additional sources. There were two additional sources. One of them was a corrupt Italian politician who's now in jail because he took money from the government of Azerbaijan to shift votes in the Council of Europe. Okay, so Azerbaijan gives money to the corrupt Italian politician, it goes to his foundation, and then part of it goes to Citizen Go to help create it. And then the final source comes from Russian oligarchs, at least Konstantin Malafiev, perhaps also Vladimir Yakunin, where there we see project proposals and a draft contract between Citizen Go and those Russian entities. And so I say this is a case of a very clear case of astroturfing, where you have all of these different people and individuals who have created or helped co-fund Citizen Go, which then tries to pass itself off as a community of concerned individuals and citizens simply trying to make their voice heard.
Thank you so much. Incredibly scary note to end on, I'm afraid, but thank you. That's been absolutely fascinating. I'm sure you'd all like to show your thanks. I know I will. So, wow, what a morning already. And you now deserve your coffee. And I'm told we have the coffee break until 11:20. Did I get that right? I'm told I did. So thank you. See you later.